Great, I'll get us started. My name is Corinne Waldo. I'm the Economic Development Director of the Boulder Chamber, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our Food Service, Hospitality, and Events session of our weekly updates. There's going to be a lot of important information, updates. You've probably heard a lot of things in the news lately, so we want to make sure you have the best information. You can answer your questions, get your questions answered, and then provide feedback and information. I'm not going to go any longer because there's a lot of information, so I'm going to hand it off to Lane Drager with Boulder County Public Health.
Thanks, Corinne. And thank you everybody for joining. So we've got a fair bit of stuff we want to share before we have time for your questions and answers. So we'll just jump right into it. So here's a rough agenda of what we want to cover today. Definitely talk about where we're at with the public health orders, some of where we're at with our surveillance, our epi data, the ideas of moving to the next phases of protect our neighbors and the potential for a countywide variance. And then we'll get into those sector updates in your Q&A. So again, here's where we're at in our evolving timeline and sort of things that are on the horizon. So we have seen, again, continued iterations that have freed up more activities that have hopefully helped most of the businesses start to regain some of that opportunity, but hopefully doing it safely. And we're still looking at that horizon for that next phase of protect our neighbors, but still some uncertainty of what exactly that'll look like and what it will take for us to get there. So many of you have joined us in the past. This is a slide that you've seen before, and we kind of continue to hammer away that this is such a long-term effort. You know, the evolution has been successful for the most part, but we are going to talk about a pretty major slide backwards for Boulder County and why it's so important that we stay this course and that we really need that commitment moving forward. Because until we have a vaccine and really have something that protects our community, we're going to be in some evolution of these safer at home kind of models. And again, the virus, as we'll highlight again with our epi data, is still very contagious, and the concerns are really those close contacts of folks. We also have concern about asymptomatic folks being part of that. So it is really important that we really continue to adhere to these various changes, but still understanding that importance to social distance and wear masks, stay home when you're sick, all of the pieces that we've been talking about. Face coverings, again, that's probably created confusion, you know, with various orders within the county. You need to have a face covering with you at all times, because there are going to be times when you're going to encounter people and you're not going to be able to social distance. We aren't saying you must wear a mask at all times, but that's even the best practice, because then you never have to worry about putting it on or off and any of those issues. But we definitely need people to have masks with them at all times. And it's really important that you're doing that, especially when you're inside businesses and you can't socially distance. We do have that face covering script, again, to help the businesses if you're running into patrons who are not wanting to wear face coverings or not bringing them. And it is important that you try to address those issues. Here again is that summary of resources that we have. We're doing more and more to make sure we've streamlined our site. It's taken a lot of resources for us to update all the various checklists. And we're seeing, again, such an evolution from the state that we're doing more and more pointing to direct resources. So hopefully, again, our site is still very helpful to you, but it should be very consistent with what the state is also putting up there. Again, those other resources for you in helping you find some of the things that you need to be purchasing through your trade organizations, Energize Colorado, and certainly the Chamber, who's been a great resource for everyone. So we are now on the 7th revised order. We're not certain if there'll be any more changes prior to July 1st or the governor talking about protect your neighbor phase. But we are, again, are removing those checklists and really just pointing to where the state's current guidance is. It has continued to evolve, and mostly all for addressing a lot of the concerns that we've been bringing up. But again, that's going to be our plan moving forward, as a balance of being consistent with the state and also managing our resources. So here is an unfortunate graph that had been doing incredibly well. So what you see on this graph, as the graph is rising in areas, those are our 5-day average number of cases. So as we're looking over the last 5 days, how many cases are coming in per day? And so we obviously wanted that number to stay very low and ideally continue to drop. And it was very successful. So it really highlights how important all the different phases were and how successful they were. And again, we were very successful all the way through May and into June, even with the evolution of businesses starting to reopen and our social distancing. Everything was incredibly successful until we hit that sort of 2 weeks ago, where we had the real big spike because of the outbreak in Boulder. And largely this centered around people not social distancing, partying on the hill, some potential connections to protests and people being, again, in very close proximity. So all the messaging that we've been talking about, that's how quickly things can turn. And actually the spike is probably the highest number that we had seen, because some of the earlier spikes that you see kind of at the end of April and May were a little bit of an artifact of late reports coming in. So getting all of that on a certain day, even though that's not necessarily the day that some of those people were identified as cases. So really kind of the worst case scenario we've seen since dealing with COVID happened because of that outbreak. So how important it is for all of you to be very diligent about making sure your staff are not sick. If they've been exposed to sick people, that we're doing our quarantine and isolation. It's so critical, because you can see how quickly that changes. So again, here's some more information of kind of what's going on. There are a number of outbreaks that are still active, and we have some other suspect. So these take quite a while to fully resolve, given the incubation periods for the disease. So we're really looking at making sure we don't continue to see active cases connected with those illnesses to know whether it's truly done. So we're still a little ways off before we have any potential to see some of those be resolved. Again, to date, 45 workplaces have been assessed, and we've seen 6 just in the past week. So we're really remaining diligent. We have a number of staff working on this. We continue to try to identify our roles. But again, if we see more explosions, it's really going to press our resources and our ability to continue to respond. So some more information we wanted to share is kind of what's being done related to this. Whether you all see the direct connection or not, these outbreaks, again, even though they're not necessarily being caused by businesses, have huge impact to you and your businesses, given that people could be working for you or could become patrons that are coming in your door, and can jeopardize our ongoing success at continuing to move forward with these orders. So the City of Boulder has an executive order addressing some of these under their public nuisance definition and their ability to address those. There's also work with the University of Colorado looking at their code of conduct, and so holding students accountable for any certain egregious violations. We know that there are students that have gotten sick through no fault of their own because the disease just works that way, but certainly people that are breaking the orders, breaking the law, having large gatherings and parties, not social distancing, not wearing masks. Those are obviously things that we need to address, and address very quickly. So there is an article that kind of helps explain a lot more of this. So this link will be in the PowerPoint that gets shared, so you can read more about that at a later date. But again, this is something that the municipalities, the university, and obviously Boulder County Public Health take very seriously, and we're working collectively to try to address them. So our next phase, again, not still clear about what exactly this will look like and whether or not we're going to be ready to move into it. Given that we're in the middle of this outbreak, we're going to need to see things change again before we're able to move to next phases. But we will have sort of control in some regards of when we're going to apply to move forward. The state is still trying to work out all of the actual details of what are the things that you need to satisfy to move to that next phase. The proposed date is still starting July 1st or early July. That obviously is very soon. So again, it probably at this point will be unlikely that we jump very quickly into this stage until we have a good handle on what's happening within our county. This unfortunately is also now very much in jeopardy. Boulder County has been and is still working on a variance request to address still all those holes that have not been addressed through all the different editions through now the 7th edition of the Safer at Home. But part of the big ability for us to apply for this variance is that we have stabilized case counts and that we're not seeing anything problematic. And as you saw from our epi curve, that's far from what we're seeing. So it really has jeopardized our ability to move forward with variances. So some of those sectors that still have problems with either limitations or how the state orders were scripted, unfortunately, those are likely to persist because we're likely not going to be in a situation to move forward into that variance until we see things turn around. So I'm going to turn this over now to Zach. He's going to jump into some of the specifics that relate to restaurants and bars.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me again. So yeah, let's just jump right into the changes that have occurred since we've adopted the 7th amended public health order to 2028. What I'm going to talk about are the summary of changes, but keep in mind that everything that we've talked about under Safer at Home still applies. So for example, in a restaurant, parties still need to be 8 or fewer, tables need to be 6 feet apart, things of that nature. So I'm just going to highlight the changes and the amendments that were addressed in the public health order in the latest version. So the first thing, as we're quite familiar with at this point, is restaurants where patrons go for the primary purpose of dine-in service. They may open at 50% occupancy or 50 folks, whichever is fewer. And again, that's indoor seating. Okay. Outdoor seating, as we've talked about in weeks prior, there is no limit, but there does need to be physical distancing occurring and tables need to be 6 feet apart. And as we've mentioned in previous weeks, working with your local municipality to get that additional outdoor seating is definitely an option. So please do look into that over this summer. Now, the big thing here is that bars where patrons go for the primary purpose of beverage consumption, if you could actually just go back one for me there, thank you, may open at 25% or 50 people, whichever is fewer. And again, tables need to be 6 feet apart in these situations. And then another piece here is that extra large venues where there's more than 7,200 square feet indoors, they have allowed in this order for a space calculator to be used. And so with the space calculator, we're going to link to that. It's on the state's website as well as Boulder County's website. You would be allowed in these extra large venues to have patrons up to a total of 100. Not necessarily 100 is your number. It just means up to 100. So using that space calculator is very essential here. On our next slide here, indoor bars, as I mentioned, 25% of the posted occupancy code limit or a maximum of 50 patrons, whichever is fewer. And then outdoor bars, again, just like restaurants, we're working with in conjunction with local authorities here. That's what the order actually says. And so breaking that down, what that means is similar to our restaurants, 6 foot distancing between tables. There's not necessarily a number on that. It just means that you have to have physical distancing occurring. And as I mentioned on the last slide, extra large venues where we have more than 7,200 square feet, using that space calculator for up to 100 total patrons indoors. Another change that we've seen in this latest amendment is mask requirements. So what they did for food service was just bring it more into alignment with other sectors. And so what it states here in the language is that if you have a medical condition that, there can be reasonable accommodations that, that are made so that folks don't necessarily have to wear those masks at all times under special circumstances. The other thing that it says here is that we're encouraging the use of gloves when you're in close contact with the customers or customer goods. So as we've talked about in weeks past, gloves, while not required, are encouraged. So it just clears up that language. Another interesting piece that came out of this new amendment is it addresses performers and competitors. So in our food service and bars, there's been a lot of questions about entertainment. And this latest iteration has allowed us, has given us more clarification here. And it just says that performers have to be a minimum of 25 feet from patrons. And some questions have come in about what this asterisk is. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that. We're gonna look for clarification on what they mean by that from the state, and maybe other folks on this call have some more information on that. But 25 feet distance from patrons, that's where the performers would have to be. The participants, they need to also be given symptom checks, and they should not be participating in anything if they do show any signs of illness, just like the rest of your staff. The order says that you should adopt a seating and spacing modifications to increase physical distances from those performers. So keep in mind, if you are trying to have a performer indoors and you're limited on space, it's going to be a really difficult thing to address. But if it's outdoors, maybe there's a little bit more room there for making that space available. Moving on to our next slide, the order does address installing barriers. So that's a recommendation between those performers and patrons. And again, just maximizing that physical distance, because when these folks are, if they're singing, there's more aerosols that are being put out into the air in those situations, and a little bit more risk. So the other things in this piece are that performers should use a separate entrance and exit than patrons. And it does state that they're not included in your capacity limits as long as they're not in that same that same space, right? So as long as you have the 25-foot distance, we would not include them in your capacity limit numbers. The other thing that they're very specific about here is disinfecting high-touch areas like microphones, instruments, things like that. So those are the big changes that we've seen in this latest amendment. Again, I just want to throw out there that this does not mean that all the things that we've talked about to this point are not still in effect. This is just in addition to, or clarifications to, the current Safer at Home public health order. Some other quick questions that have come in that I really want to address. Some folks have been getting confused about what sanitizing and disinfecting is and what products to use. So the biggest or the best thing that I can tell you is that the label is always the law. So what that means is the label of the chemical that you're using is going to tell you what it is intended for and what uses it can be used for. So Windex, for example, is not a certified EPA registered disinfectant. We've been getting reports that maybe because folks are low on supplies, that things like window cleaner are being used to disinfect tables between customers. So just want to really address that and let folks know you have to have an EPA registered chemical that addresses the use, okay? The other thing that's come in quite a bit over really since the beginning of the order is face masks and face coverings. As I mentioned, there is some clarification there for allowances when you can not have to wear a mask, but just as a rule of thumb, wear the mask unless there's some kind of significant medical condition. The masks should be worn at all times, and the customers coming into your establishment, when they come in and when they exit, and really any time other than eating or drinking, they need to be wearing those masks. The complaints continue to roll in. So you as a business owner just need to be aware that that all goes into consumer confidence. When folks see that you're allowing people into your establishment without those face masks, then they lose confidence in your ability to help control this disease and the spread of it. And with that, I think those are all the updates for me.
All right, I'm John Holste, Special Events Coordinator with Boulder County. We'll go through these short-term rental requirements again. These have not changed in the past few weeks. So again, I'm not going to spend as much time on these because I know the primary focus here is on some of the new events guidance. But let's go over these one more time. Owners are still responsible for ensuring that their property is properly cleaned and sanitized. It's suggested to remove things like the soft objects that are difficult to clean, and your throw pillows, decorative pillows, those kind of things. And if you can, please avoid scheduling back-to-back stays so that there's at least 24 hours between guests, so that you have enough time to properly clean and disinfect, not just having somebody rush in there and do an hour's worth and maybe missing some kind of surface that could be a point of contact for the disease. If you can, provide a no contact check in, check out, or at the very minimum, you need to maintain that 6 feet of social distance, have a face covering for any interactions with guests, and inform them of the face covering order that's still in effect here in Boulder County, as well as and be a little bit more flexible than you might usually be in terms of your cancellation policy. You don't really want to have somebody not cancel their stay if they're feeling asymptomatic just because they're not going to get their money back. So especially if somebody were to reach out to you, be a little bit more flexible than you typically would be to prevent that situation from occurring. And then still the same guidance from the state and the CDC. Again, this really has been consistent the past few weeks, so I'm not going to spend that much time here. Let's go forward to events, where we do need to spend some time. So we have, I'm going to talk about events in a broad sense first, and then we're going to split into two kind of categories of events: your life rights, houses of worship, and then everything else. But across all events, this is the general guidance from the state that you need to implement, no matter what kind of event you're having, what kind of life right ceremony. If you're feeling sick or you think that you've been in contact, stay at home. And same with vulnerable individuals. They're strongly recommended to remain at home to help prevent the spread. Face coverings required for all attendees, required for employees, operators, unless it's going to inhibit the individual's health, in which case, you need to make some reasonable accommodations there. But for an event, regardless of what kind of event it is, the basic plan you need to come up with is you need to have a protocol for symptom screening. And this link actually goes back to the state's website that kind of talks about what we're meaning there, because there's not a one size fits all. There's several options here, but they've outlined exactly what you should be developing in your symptom screening plan. Zach already touched on that designated activities, and in terms of if you're going to have, for instance, some music at there. I think I incorrectly put the distance in here. But in terms of your performers, they need to be at least 25 feet apart. If they can, use that separate entrance and exit. You need to have a plan for cleaning bathrooms and high-touch surfaces regularly. That doesn't mean just we're going to clean it once before the event starts, and then after the event's over, we're going to clean it all again. You need to do that too, but you also need to have a plan to clean these high-touch surfaces and bathrooms during the event. and then a plan for direction of movement and seating of guests, patrons, worshipers during arrival and departure, and to manage traffic flow, during the event, whatever that is, to ensure that capacity limits are followed and that social distancing is maintained across the event. So now we're going to break up into two different discussions. So the first one's going to be for life rite ceremonies and places of worship. I know there's a lot of confusion here, so I'm going to do my best to be as clear as I can be. But life rite ceremonies on the state's website are things like baptisms, funerals, bat mitzvahs, graduation ceremonies. They don't necessarily need to be a religious ceremony, but a lot of them do have a basis there. But there are some other things that are outlined there. And the capacity requirements for these life rite events and ceremonies, or life rite ceremonies and places of worship, are that indoors you're allowed to have up to 50 people or 50% of the venue's capacity, whichever is fewer. And you need to use the social distancing calculator found on the state's website to determine what the maximum occupancy for your space is. If a place of worship has a single extra large room, then that capacity can be increased to 100 people total indoors, as long as that, again, that room meets the size requirements of the social distancing calculator. Outdoors, if you're up to 175 people, we ask that you follow the state guidance, use that social distancing calculator to determine your maximum occupancy, and that's it. Over 175 people, we are asking that you submit a plan to public health for review. And I think I mentioned this on last week's call, but if you are a wedding venue, for an example, or a church, you're going to have likely multiple events going on. You do not need to send us a plan for every single event if you're going to use the same basic setup for these events. Send one plan that shows, how the wedding is going to be held. The altar is going to be here. This is how guests are going to enter and exit. All those things I just talked about on the last slide. And then that can apply to all the weddings or all the services or whatever in that space, rather than saying, okay, well, for the Jones wedding, we're going to do this. And then for the Smith wedding, we're going to do the same thing. Don't bother with that, please. Just send one plan to cover all of those. Now, where this gets tricky, receptions, associated parties, so wedding receptions, baptism party, anything like that, those are not covered under this guidance. They are covered under the indoor and outdoor events guidance, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, which has some slightly different requirements. So in the indoor events, you need to use the social distancing calculator to calculate the maximum of your space up to 100 people. For outdoor events, use that same calculator to determine the maximum of your space up to 175. Otherwise, you just need to follow all the state guidance that is applicable for your indoor and outdoor event. Again, some of the things were covered in Zach's in terms of performers or things like that. I'm not going to go through all of that stuff here today, so I would ask that you please, please, please read the state guidance and then use that social distancing calculator to determine what the maximum occupancy of your space is, because that's really going to drive the amount of people you're going to be able to have at your event. And then all events need to apply to any other local codes, ordinances, permitting requirements, public health orders. So there may be some, face masking requirements that are different in a municipality, or a municipality might have a smaller limit. You need to check with those municipalities to make sure that you're following all of their restrictions and requirements.
Thanks, Zach and John, and Lane as well. I just wanted to jump in here quickly and let everyone know that we are going to continue to have the industry office hours as listed here. One change, the Thursday general sessions will no longer happen. So this slide is wrong. I failed to remove it from the slide deck. So there will be no Thursday general session, but our Tuesday sessions will continue into the future. And then finally, just how to contact us. If you've got questions, comments, concerns, please use our COVID biz at bouldercounty.org email. If you've got a complaint or you prefer to call, you can call our call center and they will log your complaint or question and we will respond using that. So with that, Corinne and everybody else, the questions can begin. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We have quite the slew of individuals here from Boulder County Public Health. We have Marianne Mahoney from the Boulder Convention and Visitors Bureau and myself, all here to support you. So please submit your questions via Q&A. I'm also going to be launching a poll right now to ask you about face coverings and social distancing, because we're coming to the end of Boulder County's face covering order and they need your feedback. It will also be linked to in the email that I send. So I'm going to launch that right now. While I do that, either John or Zach, if you could answer the question of how much distance does there need to be between patrons and performers for a live outdoor performance?
I am scrambling to find that answer. I believe it's that 25 feet that Zach had, and I'm not sure where that 50 feet came from. So I am going to say 25 feet, and Lane or somebody else, please tell me if I've put my foot in my mouth there, please.
Yeah, the public health order doesn't disseminate between indoor and outdoor. It just says 25 feet. So 25 feet, whether indoor or outdoor.
Thanks, guys.
So John, could you explain, I put the link in the chat, but could you explain a little bit further about the distancing calculator and give examples? You know, how much distance are they giving each person? Because it's quite a bit.
I would actually, is there somebody else who can explain that a little bit better? Because I am not actually the best person to ask on that.
I can try and do that. So the space calculator is really trying to look at how much space makes sense to allocate per person so that you can have people moving around and still be able to social distance. So really looking at setting up a 12 by 12 area for each person, which would allow them to move freely around other people without violating or getting closer than 6 feet. If you only measure 6 feet between each person, people are not able to move around freely and not still stay 6 feet away from each other. So that's really what that's based on, to be ideally the most protective. Yeah, that image is a great one to kind of highlight. When you have people that are just 6 feet apart, as soon as one person takes a step in any direction, they're now closer, and then every other step they take. So there's no way for a person to navigate through all the other people and still be able to social distance. So when you see the image on the left, you're going to have way too many people in your location and venue to actually allow them to social distance. The other one is going to be very protective and allow for people to be able to move pretty freely around other people and still social distance.
So basically, you're giving each person about 144 square feet, if I do my math correctly. The way the calculator works, and in here Jesse's showing it, is that you put your square footage minus the amount of space used for furniture, equipment, chairs, all of that, and it'll calculate your the number of people.
And again, that's now your maximum starting point. And so now you still have to look within your venue. Are there any issues that it still creates where you feel like there's still too many people to manage, and you would further reduce it from there? So that would still be now your maximum starting place.
Great.
Thanks,
So,
Lane.
John, this changes the dynamic of events. You know, the events as we know them, it's not the same. So when we say you have indoor and outdoor events, when you say networking events or where you have people standing around cocktail tables, that's really does not fit under this guidance, correct? What kind of events would fit under this kind of guidance?
I mean, the state leaves it fairly broad. I mean, in theory, you could have a networking event so long as everybody's going to be maintaining that 6 foot of distance. It's going to feel a lot different. You know, obviously, you're going to want to have masks on. People are probably going to feel like they're going to have to shout a little bit because you're standing further away from folks. But you know, I think I mentioned on last week's call, like on the wedding receptions, you know, like the dancing is really not something we want to see as a part of wedding receptions right now, which is a little tricky because it's a traditional part of any kind of wedding reception. But you know, the state's order basically says that if it hasn't been called out in a specific industry now, this indoor, if there's not specific guidance like there is for the life right ceremonies or for some of these other things, it's covered under that indoor and outdoor events. So if it can meet all the requirements laid out there, it's an acceptable event. It's likely that it's going to be look and feel a lot different than the pre-COVID event would, that's of a similar nature.
So, like, for example, normally you might fit 10 people on a 6-foot round, seated that aren't family. You're not going to do that anymore.
Correct.
You need to make sure the 6 feet distance.
Yeah, you need to. I mean, you want to seat households together, and then make sure that there's that proper distance between households. So, if you had, like you said, a 6-foot round, if it's everybody who's in the same household, that's fine. But if they're not, they need to be seated separately.
Okay. And let's think about this in a business setting. So we have a lot of hotels and business people on. If you have, people bringing in coworkers or colleagues or people from other businesses, or it's cross business, those aren't same household individuals, correct?
That's correct.
They have to be distanced.
Yep.
Okay.
And we just want to call out that as far as the restaurant dining, which is obviously a part of some of these celebrations, it limits the tables. And it doesn't necessarily require they have to be from the same household, but they cannot have more than 8 people at a table. So there's other pieces that you need to look at. But again, it isn't a good idea to be mixing across groups. Certainly the idea of people in bars socializing and violating that 6 foot is going to start to trigger enforcement, which is not the area we want to go. We want to give businesses an opportunity, but you have to really understand and appreciate and make sure these things are happening. Otherwise, things are going to go backwards.
Okay. Thank you.
This Marianne, I do have a comment to support. We've seen this outbreak of COVID cases, and it's a young population. And what concerns me is that the young population may be some of the service workers that we have in town. And I would really hope that everybody on the call is encouraging your employees that the face covers are not just for work. They're for everywhere you're going. And that the more compliance that we have, we can bring these cases back down and be able to get a variance once our cases have stabilized. So I just really want to plead to everyone to really encourage your employees to be part of this solution, because I think everybody was very, very discouraged when these cases were reported. Now it's more than discouraged, it's impeding our growth in business. So please, please, please.
Thank you, Marianne. We get a lot of calls on the chambers and economic developments and in your company talking about we want to have less restrictions, or we want to do these things, but the data is going up, and what can we do to support that? And it's talk to your patrons, talk to your staff about how this is more than just requirements in the business, and their actions outside business impact your company, your business, your customers, the contact tracing. I hope that we can continue to communicate that as a community and as businesses. All right, so I have a question about bars at events, John, and this will probably tie back to the food and bar regulations, but what are some, you have those temporary bars at hotels or at weddings and so forth, where they're serving drinks. What are some precautions they should take to ensure that they're following safe practices at those bars?
I'm not sure that I know exactly. I think that you'd be taking the same that you'd be taking at any of the other, like the same as a regular bar. I don't know that the state has any specific guidance for temporary bars that's different from what you would see in there. I mean, you don't want to have people congregating and just hanging out at the bar. You can, for service, but not a place to gather like you would in the traditional sense. Zach and Lane, is there anything else that I'm missing there that, I can't say that I've read specific guidance that says what a bar at a temporary event needs needs to have?
Yeah, I can't specifically call out, a temporary bar, but I can say that in the restaurant and bar guidance, we still see that there is no seating available at a bar where food or drink prep is taking place. So in a temporary situation, a temporary bar situation, it would be strongly encouraged that you have some type of barrier set up, because what you have is open drinks and possibly folks without face coverings within that 6 foot distance. So strongly encourage barriers, and I would liken it to a cashier checkout type situation in the restaurant, where again it's called out that it's encouraged that barriers are set up. So there shouldn't be any seating available at these temporary, wheel out bar situations. And I think an easy, or not necessarily easy, but a barrier would be encouraged.
So it's clear that you need to follow the restaurant and bar guidance within the food service part of these events that are happening. So you need to look at several sets of guidance. So John, you mentioned a little bit about if you're a single wedding facility and you do many weddings and you want to just submit the plan you have in place for those weddings, are you going to have some sort of form, or they could just need to submit it to covidbiz@bouldercounty.org?
I think for the interim, we're hoping to have a form in part of the guidance. I'm not sure we've had the capacity to build that quite yet. So in the interim, we're going to use covidbiz@bouldercounty.org just so that way it can get be a central point of contact and then get shipped out to whoever actually needs to review it and take a look at that. But then in the future, the hope would be that we can have a form that will help guide you a little bit better. And maybe, if you answered a certain way, it'll change the questions that are going to be asked. But for now, in lieu of that, we'll just use that covidbiz@bouldercounty.org.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then anybody on the call can answer this. Is bleach water still considered a good disinfectant sanitizer?
Yes, it's one of the approved. You just need to make sure it's the right concentration so that you haven't diluted it too much or that it's not too strong.
Okay. So just to clarify, are guests required at all private events like weddings and life rights ceremonies to wear face masks the duration of the event?
I believe what the state's guidance says is that they want to have face coverings unless it's going to either inhibit that individual's health or unless it's not age appropriate or you're eating or drinking. Essentially, like anytime you might come into close contact with somebody, you need to be wearing that mask.
Okay. And then just because we got a lot of questions about this, there is to make sure for the actual ceremony of like the weddings and graduations and bar mitzvahs and baptisms, you have to follow the life rights guidance, but any
Correct.
party that follows needs to follow the events guidance.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And
So in some cases, you may have a situation where you have more people at the ceremony than are allowed at the events based on the venue.
That's possible. Yep.
And I was just going to say, obviously there's probably some kind of dining or bar. So those regulations also would come into play.
Yep. So if you're an event facility or a wedding plan, you need to look at life rights, you need to look at the events, and you need to look at the food service and restaurants guidance when you're planning these, which we send out all of those with this as well as the social distancing calculator. Do we have any other events, or is there anybody else on the call? I know we have a couple extra people from Boulder County Public Health on the call today. Do you guys have anything else you wanna say in closing? All right. Well, we finished exactly in 45 minutes and you had a lot of information to put out there. I think the key trend is we need as a community to get our numbers back on a downward trend. And it's all of our responsibility, and we should all play a part in this so that we can move to the next phases when they are available. We want to thank you for attending, asking your questions, getting the information you need. And a reminder, these calls are every Tuesday at 1 o'clock for a couple more weeks. And in between the calls, feel free to email. If I'm the first email address you can find and you don't have COVID Biz or somebody else's, I can forward on your questions as well. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody.